And welcome to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this week's edition, we'll get back to our six-pack of topics. We will talk about what is next for the Toronto Raptors after they got swept. I'll give you my review of the latest Ant-Man and The Wasp trailer. I'm going to explain to you why Chris Paul is one of the greatest point guards in NBA history, as well as we're going to talk about Terrell Owens' comments about the Cowboys, along with the latest news about the fight between Disney and Comcast over the Fox Studios properties. So let's open up a six-pack and get started. Topic number one in this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. We're going to dig into deep what is next for the Toronto Raptors. And the reason why this is a fascinating topic is because the Raptors are in the unenviable position of having to figure out what they're going to do with a team that is financially strapped. You see, after being swept by the Cleveland Cavaliers, they're going to have to make some change next year because they just cannot get past LeBron. And look, I believe this franchise legitimately thought that they had it all figured out. They won a ton of games. Their head coach, Dwayne Casey, is considered one of the best coaches in the league. And you have two players at the top of your salary cap who are supposed to be all-star impact players. But we saw in this Cavs series, we also saw in the Wizards series that Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, and Serge Ibaka, their three best players, are unable to separate from the other great players around the league. Masai Ujiri has already said on the record to the media that they're not going to blow up the team. They're not going to have a total rebuild of the roster. And nothing has been confirmed about the future of Dwayne Casey. So what are they going to do? What is next? Well, I don't think the solution is firing Casey, because too many times when a coach gets fired, it's not always because the coach is holding the team back. It's because the coach has become the scapegoat because the team overpaid a bunch of players. This is not a team that is a major piece or a major element away from getting over the edge. Because the teams that have always been a coach away or a player away have had that one superstar, that one elite player that makes the difference for that team. The Raptors don't have that guy. DeMar DeRozan is a very good player. You could argue that he is one of the top 20 players in the NBA, but he is not an elite player. He doesn't change an entire franchise, an entire team. Kyle Lowry, they overpaid to keep him because they felt that they needed to keep him and they couldn't replace him, which is turning out to be a horrible decision by them. So what the Raptors need to do moving forward is not fire the head coach, because all firing Dwayne Casey does is cover up the issue, which is you barely have any money to spend in free agency, and you absolutely positively need to re-sign restricted free agent Fred VanVleet. Bring him back because he was a major component for your success this year. The solution is you got to trade one of these big names, whether it's Lowry or DeRozan. It would be ideal to trade Ibaka, but I don't know if there's a team out there that'd be willing to take on Ibaka's $20 million contract. I mean, that's a lot of money to eat. You know, I know a team, for example, like Portland, you know, they may be in the conversation. They'll look to upgrade their roster. The problem for Portland is that in order for them to get Ibaka, they're going to have to give up multiple players to get him. And I'm not even sure if Portland wants Ibaka at this point, because if you're the Trailblazers, does Ibaka really make a difference, considering that you look at the impact he had in Toronto, it was erratic. It wasn't consistent. He didn't make an impact on a night in and night out basis. The only other teams that may have a slight interest in Ibaka, you know, maybe a team like the Utah Jazz, maybe a team like the Phoenix Suns. But again, do these teams really want to give up the players and the assets necessary to make such a deal work? So then you're stuck with trading either Lowry or DeRozan. And there's a few ways you can go with that. I think the Knicks would definitely be open to acquiring a guy like a DeRozan now with Fizdale in the house. Fizdale, a guy who has coached players who are not elite three-point shooters. You know, he coached up Mike Conley. He was the assistant coach and very close with Dwayne Wade down in Miami. He knows how to coach guys who are not elite outside shooters, but who also can make an impact on the game in other ways. But at the end of the day, no matter who you move or don't move, the only way the Raptors are getting better is to reshuffle the deck. Lowry is a guy who has been underwhelming in the postseason. He has come up very small multiple times. He is not a game changer. He is not a clutch shot maker. He is not a guy who's going to change a team to make them great. But he's still a good player. And I think that if you send him to a team where he's not asked to be one of the top 2 players on the roster, he can still be a very solid number 3 or number 4 option. I think that's also where a team like the Spurs could be in the conversation. If I'm San Antonio, I'm not thoroughly convinced that the roster I have right now is going to make a difference. And if they're serious about getting rid of Kawhi, it's going to be hard to trade Kawhi in a straight-up one-for-one deal. Obviously, a Kawhi to the Sixers or a Kawhi to the Lakers, Clippers, Knicks, whoever it may be, it may not be a direct one-way sell. We can try to project, a Lowry to the Spurs or a DeRozan to the Knicks. Maybe even the Pistons get involved, considering all the salary cap limitations that they have. Reggie Jackson isn't exactly laying the world on fire in Detroit. But whatever deal they get done, Toronto has to change up this roster because they're not getting better. They've become stagnant. They're basically running in mud at this point. I am thoroughly not impressed with this roster. Outside looking in, yeah, there are different ways you can make trades work. But I have no faith, none whatsoever, in the Raptors moving forward as currently constituted. The Raptors have to realize that the Lowry, DeRozan, Ibaka combination is not a combination that's going to win you championships. It's not going to get you to the conference finals and the NBA finals year in and year out. Because guess what? The Celtics are going to be getting better. The Sixers are going to get better. Wherever LeBron is in the Eastern Conference, they're going to be a major threat. The Miami Heat are a player or 2 away from being a major contender again. It's not like and don't forget about the Bucks. I forgot about the Bucks. I mean, Giannis is out there, Middleton and Parker, and if they get a good head coach, just imagine what they can do out there in Milwaukee. We assume the Pacers are going to get better. The Raptors got to make some tough decisions, and I think among those tough decisions, it may be trying to find a way to unload Kyle Lowry, because I think DeMar DeRozan has still a ceiling for growth. I think he still has some development to do that makes him very valuable. I just don't think Lowry paired with DeRozan is a winning formula, and firing the head coach isn't going to solve the roster problems for this team. Topic number 2, we're going to get back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as on the heels of the massive success of Avengers Infinity War, as it's breaking box office records left and right, the trailer for the new Ant-Man and the Wasp movie, which is coming out this summer, hit last week. And this is a great change of pace for Marvel. This is very important for them to have this movie come out, because Avengers Infinity War ended on a very serious note. If you heard my review last week, obviously there were spoilers in there, and I'm going to say spoiler warning right now, but the ending is kind of depressing. Thanos wins, and the heroes don't know what to do. It leaves you with a massive cliffhanger for next May's Avengers 4 movie. So Ant-Man the Wasp, and according to reports, it's set somewhere in between the events of Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War. So this is not chronologically directly after Avengers Infinity War, at least according to reports, and we'll find out for sure when the movie comes out. But we're getting an idea of what happens after Ant-Man returns home to his daughter, and probably the reason why he is not involved with the Avengers in Infinity War. And you're introduced to Evangeline Lilly's character being the Wasp, and their team up and dealing with a unique villain that comes from the quantum realm. Ant-Man is a guy who can get really big. He can be Goliath or Giant Man, and they can shrink down to be Ant-Man. And we saw in the first Ant-Man movie that he went to the microverse and was able to come back from that size. So I'm getting the suspicion that they'll probably touch on that again, and they'll, kind of fiddle around to see, how far they can go with the quantum realm and who this lady is who came from the quantum realm, and all these various questions that have to do with not just Ant-Man, but the Marvel Universe as a whole. Because remember, the Marvel Universe, each movie kind of adds another brick, another layer, another piece of the larger puzzle. And it's going to be a more lighthearted movie. It's going to be a lot more fun, a lot more humor. Again, it's a great change of pace for Marvel, but it's also going to allow us to understand some of the ideas that Marvel has for Phase 4. Because in some ways, it looks more and more that Avengers 4 is going to be almost a reboot for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So if it's in some ways a reboot for the MCU, Ant-Man and the Wasp, well, what is their role in it? How do they work as teammates? What can they and can't they do? We're going to find all those things this summer in this movie. And I think we'll also get more information about Hank Pym's past, who's played with Michael Douglas, how it relates to the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think that part's going to be interesting as well, because with all suspicions that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is going to be ending, it's going to be done, that I think that this is basically going to tell everybody that, there's a whole chapter of Marvel we're closing the book on. We're closing a book on the 80s. We're closing the book on S.H.I.E.L.D. We're closing the book on everything that was pre-1990 in relation to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is where Captain Marvel comes in. Remember, her movie is going to be set in the 1990s. So that is another variation. So Ant-Man and the Wasp, as well as Avengers 4, is going to help close the book on all the story arcs before this year. And it's setting the stage for all the movies, which, by the way, it looks like Marvel has already booked up all their movie dates through 2025. So that gives you an idea that Marvel isn't just looking at Phase 4. They may be already planning for Phase 5 in some ways. Topic number 3 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. So Chris Paul is finally have reached the conference finals after the Rockets win over the Utah Jazz. And Paul scored 20 of his 41 points in the fourth quarter. It was a very impressive performance for Chris Paul. And first of all, it shows you the value he brought to the Houston Rockets team. A Rockets team that before he got there, they scored a lot of points. But when James Harden has a down night, somebody else has to step up. And guess what? That guy who stepped up was Chris Paul. And Chris Paul has had an amazing career. And I saw some debate online over the last 24 hours about Chris Paul's role in NBA history. And some people are saying he's overrated. Some people are saying he's underrated. Well, I'm here to tell you that when you really break it down, when you really go in the nuts and bolts of NBA history, Chris Paul isn't just a future Hall of Famer, which I think most people agree about. Chris Paul is a top 5 point guard all time, and here's why. First of all, think about what he has already done in his career. He's a 9-time All-Star, 8-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive Team. So he's an offensive and defensive force. He's been an All-Star Game MVP. He was the Rookie of the Year as well. Also, 6 different times he has led the league in steals per game. 4 different times he has led the league in assists per game. So he has cemented himself as one of the best point guards of the last 20 years. So we've already cleared that hurdle. Then you look at where he ranks historically. He's only 33 years old. So he's got at least a few more years left in the tank, you would think. He's already 9th all time in assists. And by next year, he will pass Gary Payton. At least by next year or the year after, he will pass Isaiah Thomas. He'll be within range of Oscar Robertson in a year or two. I think that Chris Paul, by the end of his career, is going to be only the 6th man in NBA history to get over 10,000 assists in his career. That list includes John Stockton, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash, Mark Jackson, and Magic Johnson. And when you think about the greatest point guards of all time, those are guys among the greatest point guards of all time. Also, we mentioned the steals. Chris Paul is more than just an offensive player. He right now is 13th all-time in steals. Next year, if he has another season like he had this year, he's going to get to probably 11th all-time, if not 10th. Because he's got a bunch of guys ahead of him that he can easily pass. He's not far behind Mookie Blaylock. He's not far behind Karl Malone. So he'll be top 10 all time. And you think about the point guards on that list, the steals list. John Stockton, Jason Kidd, Gary Payton, Maurice Cheeks. So we know that Chris Paul is an offensive and defensive powerhouse as a point guard. And then you compare him to the greatest point guards of all time. To me, I think you have to consider Magic Johnson the greatest point guard who's ever lived. Yeah, Magic Johnson did have a great jump shot, but he was a winner. He was a champion. He could play offense. He could play defense. He had phenomenal vision. He was a dynamic talent. And in some ways, he changed the game and how people view the point guard position in the modern world. So I think he's probably got to be number one. Number two on my list has to be John Stockton. John Stockton, he doesn't just have the all-time lead in assists. He's also the all-time leader in steals. John Stockton was also a clutch shooter. He was a great impact player. He doesn't get enough credit for what he did in Utah. Just because they only went to 2 NBA Finals and they lost both of them doesn't diminish how great he was. My number 3 and 4 point guard probably could be flip-flopped. You know, I have Jason Kidd at 3 and Oscar Robertson at 4. Look, you can flip-flop that. It doesn't have to be one or the other. The reason why I have the Big O at 4 and not 3 is because I look at Jason Kidd's career and how long he played and how he evolved as something absolutely incredible. But if you want to put Big O and have a Jason Kidd, that's fine. I'm okay with that. You know, the Big O, Oscar Robertson, doesn't get enough credit because he played in an era with guys like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, and he didn't win a championship till later in his career when he teamed up with Lou Alcindor, who later renamed himself Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So I like Jason Kidd ahead of the Big O because Jason Kidd went to the NBA Finals with multiple franchises, was a game changer for the league in terms of how you looked at point guards, the size of point guards in the modern age, what point guards do and don't do, how they're floor generals. And also Jason Kidd, when he came into the league, he couldn't hit the side of a barn with his jump shot. He was one of the worst shooters in the league. By the end of his career, he became a spot-up three-point shooter when the Mavericks won the NBA title. So Jason Kidd really changed the game of basketball, and he changed how you viewed the point guard position in terms of triple-doubles, in terms of defensive prowess, in terms of, you know, just being a dominant assist player. Look, I get that the Big O is one of the greatest players of all time, but I'm not sure he's one of the 3 greatest point guards. So for me, like, if you want to swap Jason Kidd and the Big O, that's fine. But I have Jason Kidd at 3, the Big O at 4. And then I have Chris Paul at 5. I have Chris Paul at 5 because you look at the guys I have behind him. Gary Payton, Pete Maravich, Steph Curry, Steve Nash, Mark Jackson, Walt Frazier. Chris Paul is a better defender than Pete Maravich, better defender than Steph Curry and Steve Nash. I think that he's also a better defender than Walt Frazier. I think that Chris Paul is a better offensive player than Gary Payton, and I think Chris Paul has a more well-rounded game than some of the other guys behind him. Gary Payton was an elite defender. He was a very good passer. But one of the things Gary Payton didn't do is he didn't always totally change how you viewed his teams. Whereas Chris Paul, he was successful with the Hornets, he was successful with the Clippers, and now he's successful with the Rockets. So 3 different teams, he has been the guy to elevate those franchises. Gary Payton, during his time in Seattle, he was a great player, but I like Chris Paul's offensive game better than Gary Payton's. You know, I like Chris Paul's defense better than Pete Maravich. I like Chris Paul's defense and his passing better than Steph Curry. I like Chris Paul's defense and just all-around offensive game better than Steve Nash. Even though I know Steve Nash was an MVP, I think Steve Nash, those MVPs were won because the one year they didn't want to give it to Kobe, and the other year his stats were so phenomenal that you couldn't deny him. Mark Jackson was a very good point guard in the NBA, one of the most underrated passers of all time. and a very underrated defensive player, but he's not on the same skill level as Chris Paul. So to me, there's a whole group of guys behind Chris Paul, but I see flaws in all their games. The guys who are ahead of Chris Paul on my list: Magic Johnson, Jason Kidd, Oscar Robertson, John Stockton. They were very complete basketball players, like Chris Paul is. And the reason those guys are ahead of him is because nothing's going to budge me off of the top two. It's Magic and John Stockton, 1-2 all day long. If you want to say Stockton's ahead of Magic, I can have that conversation. If you want to say Big O and have Jason Kidd, that's fine. But those four are some of the most complete basketball players to ever play in the NBA. And Chris Paul is putting on a resume just like those guys. And maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, maybe we will look at Chris Paul because of what he accomplishes in the near future and says, look, at the end of his career, Chris Paul did X, Y, and Z. You got to put him ahead of Jason Kidd, or you got to put him ahead of Big O for this or that reason. It's just a shame that Chris Paul plays in the era that he's playing in because he hasn't really been able to play with some of the elite players in today's game. When he was playing with the Hornets, who was the best player he played with? David West? David West wasn't even a top 5 power forward for most of his career in the league. He was a very good power forward, but wasn't even top 5. When he was in Los Angeles with the Clippers, DeAndre Jordan was a very limited player offensively. Blake Griffin couldn't stay healthy half of his career at the Clippers. He had Jamal Crawford coming off the bench doing half the team's scoring at times. And aside from that, Chris Paul had to carry that team. He was the difference maker. He was the guy who had to elevate them. And you could argue when Chris Paul left, the team was a mess. In fact, the Clippers didn't get better until they got rid of Blake Griffin. They got rid of Blake Griffin. That's when they went on the big run that they did. They tried to make the playoffs this year. Before they had Blake Griffin, and the team was a mess. The team was in shambles without Chris Paul. And now Chris Paul is going to the conference finals, where he basically had to carry the Rockets in with 41 points, 20 of those points in the fourth quarter. James Harden is a volume scorer. If you want to say Harden is the best player he's ever played with, I'll give you that. But that's still not saying much, because Harden, if not for his scoring, he's not much else. He's a makeshift point guard in the image of Mike D'Antoni's offense. He doesn't play very good defense. His defense is erratic and spotty. And like I said, his offense is based on volume. It's not based on any elite part of his skill set. He has a very good handle, but doesn't have a great handle. He's not an elite shooter. He's a good to very good shooter. And a lot of his points, he has to shoot the ball 18 to 30 times to get those points. Whereas guys like Steph Curry, guys like Kevin Durant, guys like LeBron James, the elite players in this league don't have to shoot that many times to get their buckets each game, whereas James Harden does. And that's why Chris Paul is such a phenomenal complement to James Harden, because Chris Paul is a two-way player. He's an unselfish player. He can score when you need him to. He can play defense when you need him to. Chris Paul is one of the 5 greatest point guards to ever play this game, but the guy doesn't get the recognition because everyone uses, well, he didn't win a championship. Well, he's getting to the first conference finals in 2018 when he's 33 years old. Whatever excuse you want to come up with, I'm telling you right now, you have underrated Chris Paul for most of your lifetime. And the craziest thing of all, Chris Paul is undoubtedly, he is the best basketball player to come out of the 2005 NBA draft. Might I remind you, that was a draft where Andrew Bogut went number 1 and Marvin Williams went number 2. I'm not going to get into this conversation right now, but I always talk about how every year Darko Milicic is picked ahead of Dwayne Wade, right? This is another example. Chris Paul went 4th in this draft. This draft was full of guys who didn't do much of anything in the NBA. Ironically, Chris Paul is one of the only players left from this draft still playing in the NBA. Might I remind you, one of those guys, 2 of those guys are in the playoffs this year. CJ Miles and Ersan Ilyasova were taken in the second round. So Chris Paul isn't just a generational player. He's not just one of the 5 greatest point guards of all time, but he's another encapsulated example of how NBA executives think they know who the best players are, and they really have no idea at all. Topic number 4 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. So, Season 2 of Iron Fist, the Marvel Netflix show, which is part of their mini Marvel universe on Netflix, finished filming and is expected to debut later this year. No official date on the debut, and that makes a lot of sense. Jessica Jones premiered earlier this year. Luke Cage season 2 is set to hit in June, and Daredevil season 3 will probably debut after that, and after that will be Iron Fist. What's interesting about Iron Fist is that it was, of all of the Defenders shows, of all the characters of Daredevil, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and now Punisher, Iron Fist was the show that people disliked the most. And some of the reasoning people had for disliking it, I thought was pretty petty and stupid. You know, the expectation that Marvel should change the character, you know, to meet certain people's standards. Either way, they have a new showrunner now. It's Raven Metzner. He's taken over for Scott Buck. Scott Buck, who had 2 series that were poorly received. He also was in charge of the Inhumans miniseries, which was much, much, much worse compared to the Iron Fist show on Netflix. And part of the reason why the Inhumans show was worse was because of the fact that it had no purpose, it had no value, it had no substance in the grand scheme of things. It was a standalone show unto itself. What makes shows like Iron Fist great and the Marvel movies great is that they're part of something bigger, they're part of something more. They're adding layers to a bigger, large scheme of things, and they happen to be well written, and they happen to have very good acting. So where Inhumans failed because of Scott Buck, Iron Fist was successful despite of Scott Buck's work with the show. And we're going to see Danny Rand's character come back. There's a lot of rumors about who's going to be the villain. I don't want to throw a lot of speculation out there because I'm not fully sure where the show is going to go. But one thing I am sure about is this is a chance for Iron Fist to develop his character beyond an origin story. You know, the Iron Fist season 1 was all about introducing who the character is, why he's here, him learning about his abilities and his purpose in the world and his company and his family and why his parents died and all these different things. Now, in a world post-Defenders where the Hand has been defeated and New York knows that there are these, you know, ground-level superheroes out there running around the city, specifically in Hell's Kitchen with Daredevil and in Harlem with Luke Cage. Now we get to see a little bit of the corporate side with Iron Fist. And as I've mentioned to you folks before, the beautiful thing about the Netflix shows is that if you love the storytelling and the acting and the intensity of the premium channel television shows, you know, whether it's Game of Thrones or Billions or Power or any of those types of shows, Westworld is out there as well. If you like that type of storytelling, if you like that type of acting and that type of level of quality production, then you really need to check out the Netflix Marvel shows, because that's where Marvel has put some of their best work out there for audiences. That's where Marvel has really opened up a whole new way of giving people these great characters. And now, especially with Daredevil going into season 3, you're taking the ability to binge watch a character and dive into a character to another level. The one thing I'm really disappointed about is that Marvel hasn't found a way to take Jessica and Luke and Danny Rand and all these different characters and maybe put them into one of the movies or do a crossover with Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, I'm assuming the reason why they haven't done a crossover with Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is because there's probably some major contract issues when it comes to Netflix and ABC. Furthermore, this idea that you couldn't put one of these characters in the movies in some role somewhere, I think is a little cheap as well. I understand Marvel has been hyper-focused on this whole Avengers 3, Avengers 4 arc, but you still could have found a way to get these characters into these movies. You know, even if it's a small role, like Ant-Man goes to New York and he's looking for a little help from a private investigator and he happens to run into Jessica Jones. You know, that would have been fun. That would have been a cool crossover. But either way, the Netflix shows are still great. And the cool thing is you don't have to wait for the show to come out. You got Netflix. You can watch it whenever you want. You can binge watch it how you want, 2 episodes at a time, 4 at a time. I know some people like to watch all 12 at a time. I know for me, the first season of Iron Fist, I watched 4 episode increments. So I got it done within 3 different days. And I think that people need to give these shows a chance, if you haven't already, because this is where the comic book storytelling is really translated. See, the movies encapsulate the adventure and the excitement inside of comic books, but the Netflix shows encapsulate the storytelling and the character development and the things that don't always get fleshed out in a movie because of the fact that you only have about 2 hours to get this thing done. So whereas on the Netflix shows, you can get a little more depth. So definitely check out. I know Jessica Jones is already on Netflix. Luke Cage comes out some point in June. Daredevil later this year. But right now, if you haven't watched the Netflix shows, give it a shot. Take some time, to binge watch some of them. Iron Fist Season 2 expected to come out later this year. Topic number 5 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. All-time great NFL wide receiver Terrell Owens was a guest of Solomon Wilcots on Sirius XM radio, and he was asked about his thoughts about why the Cowboys haven't had a lot of success in the playoffs over the years. And on one hand, I guess you could say I was a little surprised of how long his answer was. I thought he made a lot of great points. I kind of wanted to bring them to you here. So this is from Sirius XM radio with Solomon Wilcots, talking about Terrell Owens going into the Hall of Fame this year, by the way, a little long overdue, about what is wrong with the Dallas Cowboys. Take a listen.
I think it's the coach. The players are going to be the players. I think when you look at, since I left in 2009, nothing has really changed. And you think about the great players that are coming in and out of that organization, it can't be just all players.
So he points right to the coach. T.O. is going right for the coach, which is Jason Garrett. And I think while it emphasizes what a lot of people have been saying for a while about the Cowboys, about how Jason Garrett, people perceive him as a puppet of Jerry Jones, how he's an extension of the owner, just another yes man in the circle of Jerry Jones. Jerry Jones doesn't like confrontation from his coaches. T.O. goes on to dive even deeper into his issue with the coach.
Wade Phillips was the head coach when I was there. Garrett was the offensive coordinator, and for whatever reason, Wade was fired, and Garrett got put into that position. I think up to a couple of years ago, his record was pretty much identical to Wade's. So, in my mind, Garrett should be fired if that's the case. So I think that pretty much has been the Achilles heels for the Cowboys, because you can't keep using the players or player as an scapegoat as to why you're not succeeding.
He goes on to call on Jerry Jones to do something about this.
Jerry Jones has to take a deep look at himself and what's going on within the organization from a coaching standpoint, because you need somebody that's going to lead those guys and put them in the best positions to see.
T.O. makes a great point, but it's a lot of things that people already knew, and that is Jerry Jones. I don't know how much more patience he's going to give Jason Garrett, especially if the Cowboys have success. Anytime a coach is winning, it's hard to figure out when you should or shouldn't move on from him. And we've seen instances where coaches got fired when they shouldn't, when they're successful. Like Marty Schottenheimer, he gets fired after the Chargers have a phenomenal season, and the GM doesn't want him there anymore, wants to get a new guy in there, thinks that's the solution. It doesn't work out. We've also seen situations where coaches, despite the success they've had, they're fired because they're not the new GM's guy, like Jim Caldwell with Detroit. He was not the new GM's guy. The new GM didn't hire him, and because the new GM, Bob Quinn, comes from a Patriots background, what did he do? He went out and got a Patriots coordinator. So you look around the NFL, you realize that typically coaches are not given the kind of leash that Jason Garrett has been given in Dallas. And I don't think that, whether it's Dak Prescott, Tony Romo, or whoever's quarterback, I don't think that's going to change the fact that Jason Garrett is not taking this team to a new level. He's not making this team that much of a better team. Just look at the huge difference between Doug Peterson and Chip Kelly in the Eagles locker room. The Eagles players didn't like Chip Kelly. They didn't want to play for him. It was a bad locker room. It was a bad environment in the building. Doug Peterson, the players love him. They want to play for him. They speak very highly of him. They have a lot of confidence in him and his ability to coach and his faith in them. Two totally different situations. The Cowboys have a history, a long history, of mediocre coaches who have come through that franchise. After they got rid of Jimmy Johnson, they forced him out of Dallas. They brought in Barry Switzer, a guy who was basically going to let Jerry do whatever Jerry wanted. And since then, for many years, it was a lot of yes men, a lot of guys who basically just did whatever Jerry Jones wanted. And they put up with whatever Jerry Jones gave them, whether it was Dave Campo and Chan Gailey and now Jason Garrett and Wade Phillips before Garrett. In between there, Bill Parcells was there, but part of the reason why Parcells didn't stay around is because he butted heads with Jerry. He insisted on doing things his way. And Jerry, that was the reason why he got rid of Jimmy Johnson, because Jimmy wanted to do things his way. And Jerry's like, all right, well, we did it your way. Let's do it my way now. And I want some credit for the success of this team. As long as Jerry Jones is the owner of that Cowboys team, I just don't know if this team's ever going to win another Super Bowl. I think as soon as Jerry Jones either steps away and kind of goes into like a retirement and away from the football team, or he gives full control over to his son, Steven, I think only then is when you're going to see this team truly have the success that they can have. Because this Cowboys franchise, they're more than just the most valuable franchise in sports. They're more than just a franchise with a massive stadium and an owner who has tons of money to spend on anything and everything possible to get players to come to Dallas and free agency. Jerry Jones's decision-making has hurt his own franchise's ability to get better at times. It's only in recent years they've made smart decisions. It's only in recent years they drafted an offensive lineman like Zach Martin and a tackle like Tyron Smith. Dak Prescott was not a first-round pick. So I look at the Cowboys and I see Jerry Jones as the greatest hindrance. And as long as Jerry Jones is in charge of the hiring of head coaches, T.O. is right. This team is just going to keep being the same spinning of the wheels when it comes to that franchise. And Dak's going to be held back in his development. And the franchise is going to be held back in its ability to go beyond just being a one-and-done or a second-round football team. It's going to take a coach who can take this team and this franchise to the next level for them to be the great Cowboys they were of the 90s and the 70s. But they're not going to get there with Jerry Jones only wanting a yes man, a head coach. Topic number 6 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. So we have been talking about since the start of the podcast about the potential Disney acquisition of 21st Century Fox properties. Among those properties would be Marvel Studios getting the rights back to the X-Men and Fantastic Four franchise. It would also be involved in this acquisition would be the multiple Fox Sports regional television networks across the country. Well, Comcast apparently has stepped in to try again to basically ruin this deal, even though it was announced months ago multiple times by Fox executives and by Disney executives that this was going to be a done deal. Disney's $52 billion offer now may look like it is in jeopardy because Comcast is trying to find a way to fund an all-cash bid that would top Disney's $52 billion bid. We know that the reason why Comcast really wants involvement in this deal is because of the fact that Comcast is really focused on trying to acquire the Fox Sports regional networks to add to their sports networks, along with they want the Sky Network property, the British television network, from 21st Century Fox as well. The major reason why Disney wants this purchase is because they want the movie properties back. That's why their hyper-focus was initially on 21st Century Fox Studios. It wasn't on all the other elements that were in the $52 million bid. The reason why this is all very important is because we're getting more and more information about the future plans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Originally, we released information that there were movies confirmed through 2022 and 2023. Now we're being told that the movie Marvel Studios now has plans for movies all out to 2025. And in an earnings call on Tuesday, May 7th, Bob Iger of the Walt Disney Corporation teased those on the call that new franchises could be on the horizon for the Marvel Cinematic Universe when he was asked about what they're doing in a world post-Avengers. And Iger was quoted as saying, "I'm guessing that we will try our hand at a new franchise beyond the Avengers," noting that there are 7,000 characters to work with in the Marvel Universe. And that comment is a direct implication, again, that Disney has confidence that the Fox deal is going to get done for them to get the X-Men and Fantastic Four properties back. Because any future plans for the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Disney funding Marvel isn't going to be just having a Nova movie or an Infinity Watch with Adam Warlock. You know, there's all kinds of things you want to do with the Fantastic Four, with the X-Men, that you can't do right now. And character and villains that you can't even use right now, whether that be Doctor Doom as one primary example, or Galactus. There's a lot of things you can't do because of rights issues. And if they're serious about creating all new properties after Avengers, you're going to need those characters back. So even though, according to this Reuters report, that Comcast is upping the ante to try to get this deal done, Comcast has two major things holding them back. The first thing that's holding them back is Disney and Fox have some sort of agreement in place that is going to basically not allow Comcast to get what they really want out of this deal. I think at the end of the day, this may come down to, if Comcast is able to get into conversation, I think that deal would involve Disney and Comcast sitting down and Disney saying, listen, if you want the regional sports networks and you want the British network Sky, you can have that. Give us Fox Movie Studios. I think that's maybe where the deal is going to happen. So that's why I'm not overly worried by this story about Comcast trying to make another run at this. The other issue is antitrust concerns. There is still the unresolved AT&T Time Warner merger, and that is right now in a judge's hands. Comcast won't officially submit its bid to Fox until the judge rules on the AT&T Time Warner marriage next month. So we may not get an answer to any of this until June, and it may be all for naught, because if AT&T and Time Warner doesn't prevail, it's going to hurt Comcast's ability to get a deal done for 21st Century Fox properties. Comcast's goal and Disney's goal are two different things in terms of what they really want from this deal. It's important for Marvel to get their properties back, like the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. Meanwhile, it's important for Comcast, which is now combined with NBC Universal, with all of their regional sports networks, which were rebranded NBC Sports fill in the blank city. You have NBC Sports Boston, NBC Sports Philadelphia, NBC Sports Bay Area. So you have all of these regional networks that are now went from being Comcast Sports Networks to NBC Sports Networks. So the branding is different now. The branch out would be even more massive if they could give all of these Fox regional networks into their company. I think it's less important for ESPN and Disney because of the fact that, remember, ESPN has made all of these cuts over the last few years. They cut their affiliations, the different regions, different reporters, different analysts. They cut massively back on their coverage of the NHL. They basically cut their baseball coverage staff in half. They've gotten rid of tons of payroll. Why, if you are ESPN, which is owned by Disney, want to take on a bunch of new networks if your goal over the last few years has been to cut budget, to save money, to get rid of the excess on the budget? a bunch of regional sports networks would inhibit that ability to do that. If you're Disney, you are more in the movie making business than you are in the television network business. There may come a day that ESPN gets rid of some of these ESPN channels. And I know people will say, well, why would that happen? Well, here's why. ESPN Plus is being pushed very hard right now. And if the UFC deal is anywhere as productive as they hope it is for them to be putting these fight nights on ESPN Plus now, and if ESPN is going to sit there and keep putting more and more programming on this digital platform, eventually there's going to be no need to have a ESPNU, because then eventually all of the college baseball, softball, track and field, soccer, SEC network, a lot of these channels are going to eventually be a digital programming platform. You know, there's going to be no need to put, collegiate women's gymnastics on linear television when it can just be another option on the ESPN Plus menu. ESPN News, what is the real value of that in the long run? Is that going to be a property that you're going to eventually phase out? ESPN and ESPN2, I think, are pretty much staples as networks at this point. And I think ESPN News has a longer shelf life than ESPNU. So if you're ESPN and your future you're looking at as ESPN Plus and not networks, you don't want to take on the responsibility of having more networks in your organization. If you are Fox, you don't want to totally destroy everything you've invested in when it comes to FS1, FS2, bringing in Colin Cowherd to your network, bringing in all these different people to your company as you're trying to expand your NFL coverage, as you're trying to expand with now the NFL draft and Thursday Night Football. You don't want ESPN to have your properties. You don't want ESPN to get that. So if there's a way for you to maybe bring in Comcast and cut that price off of Disney and say, hey, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sell you the movies, and we're going to sell Comcast the regional networks. That might work out for everybody in the long run financially and structure-wise. Again, this is all conjecture. This is all hypotheticals for right now. But with the Reuters story coming out, it definitely lends a lot of questions. But it seems like Bob Iger of Disney and the executives from Fox think that this deal is a done deal. And even though Comcast is trying to get their foot in at the last second, they may run out of time, because if for some reason this Fox Disney deal gets through all the red tape and gets, solidified before next month's ruling on AT&T and Time Warner merger, this may all be for naught. And I think Comcast, they need to focus more so on what they're going to do to improve their linear platforms and make sure that their programming is affordable, than sit there and obsess over Disney getting all this other stuff. I know they're rivals. I know they're competitors on multiple platforms, considering now Comcast is a part of NBC Universal. I just don't see the value for Comcast in taking on these movie studios. Whereas on the flip side, look, it may be a blessing in disguise if Comcast does step in for Disney, because that $52 billion could be brought down and they could save some money in the long run if they only walk out of this with the movie properties. Thanks for everyone listening to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz podcast. I'm glad you tuned in again this week. If you're new to the channel, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button to catch each week's episode of the Mutant Blitz podcast. If you have any thoughts or comments on this week's episode, put your thoughts in the comments section below. Give us a little feedback on what you think of this week's podcast. And I'll catch you next week right here for the Mutant Blitz podcast with me, your host, Josh Hennig.